looked down upon an Earth before the first forests had even formed. Across the open landscape, enormous columns rising more than 26 feet tall still reached toward the sky. They had no leaves, no branches, and looked nothing like any tree we know today. Their fossils are known as Prototaxites, one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world. If they weren't trees, then what created these giants? From the moment it was discovered, Prototaxites fooled scientists with its very appearance. These enormous columns rose more than 26 feet tall, with diameters reaching nearly 3.3 feet. They had no leafy crowns, no clearly defined branches, and none of the familiar form of a modern tree. They stood alone on the ancient landscape like living pillars of stone. The first known fossils were discovered in Quebec, Canada, in the 19th century. From the outside, they looked so much like trees that they were once believed to be a type of ancient tree, perhaps even related to conifers. The Smithsonian still preserves Prototaxite specimens from Quebec in its Devonian fossil collection. If this really was a tree, then where were its leaves? Trees need leaves, or equivalent organs, to carry out photosynthesis. And when scientists stopped looking only at the outside and began cutting extremely thin sections to examine what was inside, the mystery immediately changed completely. Instead of woody structures with tissues organized like those of a tree trunk, the interior of Prototaxites revealed countless tube-like and filament-like structures of different sizes, interwoven into a dense network. For more than 150 years, Prototaxites was classified under many different possibilities: plant, alga, lichen, and fungus. In 2001, Smithsonian paleontologist Francis Huber closely studied its microscopic structure and found that the internal network of filaments closely resembled the filamentous structures of fungi. Later, chemical evidence from carbon isotopes was also interpreted as pointing toward a heterotrophic organism rather than a photosynthetic plant. These findings made the hypothesis that Prototaxites was a giant fungus a highly influential explanation for many years. The Smithsonian even once described it as a kind of tree-sized fungus. But there is one important problem. Resembling a fungus does not necessarily mean it was a fungus. Moreover, Prototaxites went extinct hundreds of millions of years ago. There are no living cells to culture and no intact DNA to compare directly with modern fungi. So what we have are pieces of a puzzle: morphology, microstructure, chemistry, and geological context. In 2022, researchers even concluded that if Prototaxites truly had a fungal origin, it may have belonged to a completely extinct fungal lineage with no living descendants today. In January 2026, a study published in Science Advances brought this mystery to a new turning point. When researchers analyzed Prototaxites taeti from the Rhynie chert, they found that the fossil differed in both structure and chemical composition from known fungi, including fossil fungi from the same period. The results significantly weakened that hypothesis and supported an even more astonishing possibility. It may have represented a completely extinct lineage of multicellular eukaryotic organisms, with no surviving representatives on Earth today. So what are we really looking at when we see a piece of rock shaped like a giant tree trunk? Perhaps a tree that was never a tree. Perhaps a mushroom tree that was never truly a fungus. Or perhaps the final trace of a branch of life that the modern world has completely forgotten. Why did the evidence hidden inside Prototaxites once convince an entire generation of scientists that, before forests appeared, Earth may have belonged to giant mushroom trees? When researchers looked at the Devonian world, they did not simply guess that Prototaxites was a fungus. The first piece of the puzzle came from its very architecture. When extremely thin slices of the fossil were examined under a microscope, Prototaxites revealed a system of interwoven tube-like and filament-like structures. Some of these structures were morphologically similar to fungal filaments, or hyphae, the thread-like units that make up much of a fungus's body. In modern fungi, these filaments can branch and connect to form a network known as mycelium. Studies of close relatives of Prototaxites also found tube-like and filament-like structures bearing similarities to mycelium-like structures in modern fungi. But morphology alone was still not enough. If it was a tree, the most familiar explanation would be photosynthesis. But if Prototaxites was not a plant, a heterotrophic lifestyle became more plausible. Modern fungi do not need leaves to capture light. They can release enzymes into their surroundings, break organic matter down into smaller molecules, and then absorb them. This created a fascinating ecological model for Prototaxites. Instead of standing there like a tree and feeding on sunlight, it may have obtained material from the environment around it. The next piece of the puzzle came from chemistry. A carbon isotope study published in 2007 found significant variation in carbon isotope ratios among Prototaxite specimens and compared them with photosynthetic organisms from the same environment. The results were interpreted as consistent with a heterotrophic organism, meaning one that did not obtain carbon directly from the atmosphere through photosynthesis as plants do. This was an important step forward because it helped weaken the image of Prototaxites as an ordinary tree. But it still did not answer the question of what group of organisms it actually belonged to. Then another piece of the puzzle emerged from the very world in which prototaxites once lived. At Rhynie Chert in Scotland, scientists have found early plants, arthropods, and fungi within the same ecosystem. National Museums, Scotland, describes the Rhynie Chert as one of the oldest known terrestrial ecosystems and notes that one type of fungus found there could grow to a very large size. The image of a giant mushroom tree was not a piece of science fiction, but was once the most reasonable explanation based on the evidence available. But this is also where science becomes most fascinating. A hypothesis supported by a great deal of evidence still does not necessarily represent the final truth. That is the twist that changes the story. In 2026, new analytical tools not only reopened the question of prototaxites' identity, but also forced science to rewrite part of the story of the first giant organisms ever to rise on land. If you found this information valuable, you can help support future documentaries by tapping the Send a Gift button in the comments. We truly appreciate your support. The subject of the study was P. taiti, preserved in the Rhynie Chert in Scotland. What makes the Rhynie Chert remarkable is that the fossilization process preserved extremely fine details, allowing scientists to study not only the organism's overall form, but also its internal structure. With P. taiti, they had an opportunity to examine the tiny tubes that had once been considered possible evidence of a connection to fungi. If the old hypothesis was correct, we would have reason to expect this system to resemble at least one known group of fungi, whether modern fungi or ancient fungal lineages that have since gone extinct. Using confocal fluorescence microscopy and three-dimensional reconstruction, the research team discovered that P. taiti contained multiple types of tubes with different morphologies, including extremely dense branching networks. In particular, these tubes were interconnected in regions known as medullary spots. What mattered was not simply that they were filament-like, but how the entire system was organized. But the scientists did not stop at morphology. They continued by examining the chemical traces preserved within the fossil using spectroscopic methods, including Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. Instead, the researchers had to search for molecular fingerprints that had survived the fossilization process. The results showed that P. taiti had a molecular composition different from contemporary fungi in the Rhynie Chert and from other fungal groups included in the comparison. Notably, the chemical data also placed P. taiti apart from groups of fossil organisms such as arthropods, oomocetes, and amoebae. With prototaxites, the logic is similar. The filaments and tubes inside it once made it look like a fungus, but the 2026 study showed that both its microscopic architecture and chemical composition do not fit well with known fungal groups. This does not mean science has now proven with absolute certainty that Prototaxites was not a fungus. The study did not uncover some mysterious DNA that could place Prototaxites into a new kingdom. Instead, it built its argument around the fact that this organism does not fit within known groups. And for many years, the most compelling story was this: before giant forests appeared, giant fungi may have dominated the land. A body large enough to change the way we imagine the Devonian world, yet one that left behind no living representative we can use as a key to decode it. This also explains why the debate over Prototaxites has continued for more than 165 years. Each generation of scientists could only work with the evidence their era allowed them to access. Understanding how it lived is what can finally tell us what role it played in the ancient ecosystem. Let's start with carbon. Living organisms need carbon to build cells, tissues, and organic molecules. Modern plants solve this problem through photosynthesis. They take carbon dioxide from the air and use light energy to produce organic matter. But Prototaxites shows no leaves or photosynthetic organs, like those of vascular plants. So, if it truly had a heterotrophic lifestyle, its carbon would have had to come from organic matter already present in the environment. This is what once made the fungal hypothesis so compelling. Modern fungi can release enzymes into their surroundings, break down organic matter, and then absorb the resulting products. But we have to be very careful. Knowing that Prototaxites may have been heterotrophic does not mean we know exactly what it ate. And here is the striking paradox. The land did not yet have mature forests with thick layers of leaf litter like those we see today. Plants were still expanding across the landscape, while soils and decomposer ecosystems were still developing. So if an organism as large as Prototaxites required a substantial amount of carbon, where did that supply come from? One possibility is that it exploited organic matter from early plants, microorganisms, or layers of biological material near the ground. But there is currently not enough evidence to identify a single source of food. The second challenge is water. How did it move water from the lower part of its body to the upper part? Modern trees solve this problem through vascular tissues, especially xylem, combined with physical processes such as the pull created by transpiration. But Prototaxites shows no equivalent vascular system, so we cannot simply imagine it as a tree with roots below and a crown above. The mechanisms by which it transported water and nutrients, if it truly had a large vertical body, remain among the unanswered questions. One hypothesis that has been proposed could completely change the way we picture prototaxites. One study interpreted these structures as megarhizomorphs, enormous cord-like bundles of filaments, similar to structures that some modern fungi use to grow through soil and transport materials. So the hide of prototaxites may have provided an ecological benefit, perhaps helping disperse reproductive structures, allowing it to rise above shorter organisms, or expanding its access to the surrounding environment. But there is currently not enough evidence to confirm that any one of these functions was the true reason. A fossil is a geological record, not a photograph of the moment when an organism was alive. We still do not know exactly what prototaxites ate, how it transported water, or why it reached such an enormous size. But those very gaps give us an important clue. Because in the world of fungi and filamentous organisms, ecological power does not necessarily belong to what rises into the sky. Even if prototaxites is ultimately proven not to have been a fungus, true fungi were still present in Devonian terrestrial ecosystems and may have played a far more important role than any mushroom growing above the ground could ever reveal. So how did fungi truly conquer the land? Let's return to the Rhynie Chert in Scotland, when land was only beginning to become a suitable place for complex life. The earliest plants were still small, and terrestrial ecosystems had yet to develop forests like those we know today. But beneath their feet, a biological network had already emerged, capable of changing the way matter and energy moved through the entire ecosystem. What makes the Rhynie Chert remarkable is that ancient organisms were preserved within layers of silica in exceptionally fine detail. Because of this, scientists know not only that fungi existed, but can also observe how they interacted with other organisms. And this is what makes it so remarkable. Fungi did not appear as outsiders. They were directly involved in the lives of ancient plants. A 2023 study of Asteroxylon machiae, a plant that lived in the Rhynie Chert ecosystem, revealed evidence of parasitic fungi invading the plant's tissues. There was parasitism, there was competition, and there was also cooperation. But one of the most important discoveries lies in the symbiotic relationship between fungi and plants. But extremely fine fungal filaments could spread far beyond them, penetrating spaces in the soil that the plant itself could not reach. Put simply, fungi could transform a small root system into a vastly larger network for finding resources. Fossil evidence shows that mycorrhiza-like associations existed as early as the early Devonian. Studies of the evolution of plant-fungus symbiosis suggest that relationships like these may have played an important role in helping plants obtain resources as they expanded across the land. Today, symbiosis with fungi remains extremely common among terrestrial plants. So, when we look at a modern forest, what we see is only half the story. Modern fungi accomplish this by releasing enzymes into their surroundings, breaking down complex organic compounds, and then absorbing the smaller products. In the Devonian world, this process took place within an ecosystem that was still very different from those of today. They were part of a recycling system that kept carbon and other elements moving between living organisms, dead organic matter, and the environment. There was no thick forest soil like we have today, no dozens of layers of vegetation covering the ground. There were only rocks, minerals, water, microorganisms, and small plants beginning to spread across the land. Under those conditions, a fungal network could exert an enormous influence even though each individual fungal filament was almost invisible. That is the paradox of fungi. The harder the organism is to see, the greater its ecological role can sometimes be. That conquest may have happened through networks. This also changes the way we look back at prototaxites. If that organism truly belonged to a different branch of life, then it is not evidence that fungi once dominated Earth through sheer height. Today, some fungi can form living systems that spread across hundreds of hectares, with most of their bodies underground and completely invisible to us. Perhaps the largest fungal organism is not the one that grows the tallest, but the one that spreads the farthest. One of the most remarkable examples still living on Earth today is Armillaria ostoia, a species of honey fungus found in a forest in Oregon, United States. Looking above ground, you might see only small yellow-brown mushrooms scattered across the forest floor. But beneath the soil and tree roots, an entirely different body exists, a network of fungal filaments known as mycelium, together with cord-like structures called rhizomorphs. In 1998, researchers identified a genet of Armillaria ostoia spanning approximately 2,385 acres, equivalent to nearly 3.7 square miles. Imagine that, instead of a giant mushroom standing dozens of feet tall, we are talking about a biological organism that can spread across an area larger than 700 American football fields. What truly changes the way we understand an organism is the concept of a genet. Mushrooms growing far apart from one another are not necessarily separate individuals. In Armillaria, that network does not exist above the ground but lies mostly beneath it. What we see, the small mushroom caps that appear seasonally, are like the flowers of a gigantic organism that remains largely out of sight. So how does this enormous organism survive? Armillaria does not need light to directly produce food the way plants do. It can break down organic matter and is especially capable of invading the roots of living trees. This is why armillaria is both an important decomposer and a potentially serious forest pathogen. This shows that being giant does not simply mean being powerful. An organism can expand its body by taking advantage of the ecosystem around it. The age of the armillaria genet in Oregon has also been estimated at between 1,900 and 8,650 years, depending on the model and assumptions about its growth rate. The rate at which the fungus spreads varies with environmental conditions, and older parts of the network may die, while other parts continue to grow. Today, a fungal genet can be astonishing in the opposite way. It is almost invisible, yet spreads across an enormous area of land. These two organisms, although separated by hundreds of millions of years and impossible to simply regard as the same kind of organism, teach us an important lesson. Outward appearance does not always reflect the true scale of a fungal body. And, when that principle is brought back into the Devonian world, a new question emerges. Could the appearance of true forests, with taller vascular plants, deeper roots, and increasingly complex soils, have completely changed the rules of the game? After hundreds of millions of years on an Earth where life on land was still sparse, a seemingly simple change began to unfold. Trees learned to grow taller, develop deeper roots, and form true forests. One of the most important names in this transformation was Archaeopteris, a group of trees that possessed many features of modern woody trees, with large trunks, branching systems, and well-developed roots. These were no longer just a few isolated trunks scattered across the landscape. Earth was beginning to grow forests, and with those forests, the rules of life on land began to change as well. Imagine a Devonian landscape before large forests appeared. Rain fell onto relatively open ground, carrying mineral particles and sediment into rivers. But as trees with more developed root systems began to spread, everything changed. Roots did more than simply anchor trees in place. They penetrated the ground, created small fractures, retained water, and held soil particles in place. When trees died, organic matter was added to the environment. As more trees began living together, soil started to become a more complex living system. Trees no longer simply lived in the soil. They began helping create the very soil that future generations of trees would use. Clear evidence comes from fossil forests such as Gilboa in New York. There, scientists discovered root systems of Eospermatopterus, still preserved close to where they once grew. Remarkably, this forest did not contain just one type of tree. Multiple kinds of plants with different forms lived together, showing that terrestrial ecosystems had already begun developing ecological layers and complex interactions. As tree roots grew deeper and spread farther, they accelerated the process of rock weathering. Roots, together with microorganisms in the soil, could increase the breakdown of minerals, releasing elements that plants and ecosystems could use. At the same time, soils began retaining water and sediment differently than before. A forest, therefore, was not simply a collection of trees. It was a new geological force. So, did the first forests cool the Earth? Some recent studies even suggest that CO2 levels at the time may have been much lower than previously estimated. Therefore, forests may have contributed to climate change. But they were not a single switch controlling the temperature of the entire planet. What is more certain is that the carbon cycle became far more complex. A tree takes CO2 from the atmosphere, converts carbon into living tissue, transfers carbon into the soil through its roots, and eventually, when it dies, moves some of that carbon into soils and sediments. Over millions of years, processes like these can change the way carbon moves between the atmosphere, living organisms, soil, rocks, and the oceans. For the first time, life on land was not simply adapting to the planet. It was beginning to reshape the planet in return. And this is where Prototaxites appears in a different light. We have no evidence that the emerging forests directly killed Prototaxites. What science can say with greater confidence is that Prototaxites disappeared in the context of a terrestrial ecosystem undergoing profound change as larger vascular plants and increasingly developed forests spread across the land. Sources of organic matter, soil structure, moisture, sediment flow, and ecological relationships were all changing. The world in which Prototaxites had once lived was disappearing step by step. From a low-lying landscape with sparse vegetation to a planet increasingly covered by forests, deeper soils, and more complex cycles of matter. Even if Prototaxites was not a fungus, true fungi still played a profound role in the formation of terrestrial ecosystems. After more than a century of research, we still cannot say with certainty what this giant organism truly was, because the history of life was not written only by the organisms that survive today. It was also written by evolutionary lineages that vanished completely, leaving behind fossils large enough for us to see, but not clear enough for us to fully understand. 1 billion years ago, Earth hid a secret. Today, only a few traces remain in ancient rocks. Oceans covered almost the entire planet. Life was still simple. Everything seemed trapped in silence for hundreds of millions of years. But invisible changes were quietly shaping the future of all life on Earth. Why did a world where almost nothing seemed to happen become the greatest turning point in the history of life? If you could look at Earth from space 1 billion years ago, you probably would not recognize it as the same planet we call home today. There was no Atlantic Ocean, no Pacific Ocean, and none of the 7 familiar continents had yet come into existence. Instead, most of Earth's landmass had fused into a single immense supercontinent known as Rodinia. Rodinia did not appear overnight. It was the result of hundreds of millions of years of tectonic plates colliding and welding together. Ancient continental blocks such as Laurentia, Baltica, Amazonia, Australia, along with many other fragments of continental crust, gradually merged into one enormous landmass. Although this supercontinent disappeared long ago, geologists have been able to reconstruct its shape by studying magnetic signatures preserved in ancient rocks, the ages of mineral formations, and the remarkable similarities between mountain ranges now separated by thousands of kilometers. Surrounding Rodinia was an immense ocean that covered nearly all the remaining surface of the planet, known as Merovia. Although its exact shape is still being investigated, most geological models agree that it was the largest ocean of its time. Imagine every continent on Earth today joined into a single massive landmass. As moisture from the oceans struggled to penetrate deep into the continental interior, rainfall declined, climates became increasingly arid, and the temperature difference between day and night grew dramatically. Yet the force that truly shaped the appearance of the planet did not lie on its surface. It originated hundreds of kilometers beneath our feet. Within Earth's mantle, powerful convection currents continuously transported heat upward from the core, pulling tectonic plates across the planet at only a few centimeters per year, slower than the rate at which your fingernails grow. But over hundreds of millions of years, those seemingly insignificant movements were enough to completely reshape Earth's surface. Rodinia was born through that process, and at the very same time, it was quietly laying the foundation for its own eventual breakup. One of the clearest pieces of evidence still visible today is the Grenville orogenic belt. Between approximately 1.3 and 1 billion years ago, as the continents collided to assemble Rodinia, they created an immense mountain range believed to have rivaled the modern Himalayas in scale. After nearly a billion years of erosion, most of those mountains have disappeared. Yet their ancient foundations still extend from eastern Canada through the Great Lakes region into Mexico, while leaving matching geological signatures within ancient rock formations in Scotland and Scandinavia. The remarkable agreement in rock ages mineral compositions, and geological structures has enabled scientists to demonstrate that these regions, now separated by vast distances, were once joined together within Rodinia. As the continents shifted, ocean currents changed as well, altering the global distribution of heat, rainfall patterns, and the cycle of rock weathering. During weathering, rainwater reacts with silicate rocks, carrying dissolved minerals into the oceans, while simultaneously removing part of the atmosphere's carbon dioxide through Earth's long-term carbon cycle. That means that, simply by changing the positions of the continents over tens of millions of years, rainfall patterns could shift, weathering rates could change, atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations could rise or fall, and ultimately the global climate itself would be transformed. In other words, the slow migration of enormous masses of rock quietly determined the fate of Earth's atmosphere, its oceans, and every living organism on the planet. Rodinia was therefore a vital component of Earth's operating system, where every geological movement set in motion a chain of events that unfolded over hundreds of millions of years. Next, we will look up into the sky of Earth 1 billion years ago to discover a dimmer sun, shorter days, a closer moon, and conditions that seemed almost insignificant, yet quietly shaped the future of life itself. According to models of stellar evolution, about 1 billion years ago, the Sun emitted only around 93 to 94% of the energy it produces today. A decrease of only about 6 to 7% may not sound significant, but on a global scale, it meant Earth was receiving tens of watts less energy per square meter. If that happened today, the planet's average temperature would drop sharply, and ice and snow would expand rapidly. Yet geological evidence shows that the oceans still existed in liquid form, and life continued to develop. This is the faint young sun paradox, one of the most famous questions in planetary science. At that time, oxygen levels were still much lower than they are today, while carbon dioxide and possibly methane existed in higher concentrations. These greenhouse gases acted like a massive thermal blanket, helping compensate for the missing energy from the sun. Earth still retained enough heat to keep its water from freezing. The composition of the atmosphere itself determined whether this planet could continue nurturing life. Even the color of the sky may have been different. With lower oxygen, more greenhouse gases, and fairly intense volcanic activity during the Proterozoic eon, many scientists believe the sky may have appeared paler blue, slightly milky, or more hazy than it does today. Yet the most surprising difference was not in the light, but in time. A day on Earth 1 billion years ago lasted only about 18 to 19 hours. The reason is that the tidal force created by the Moon has continuously slowed Earth's rotation over billions of years. At the same time, angular momentum has been transferred to the Moon, causing our satellite to gradually move away at an average rate of about 3.8 centimeters per year. A figure confirmed by lunar laser ranging experiments, which use retroreflectors placed on the Moon by the Apollo astronauts. If we turn the clock back 1 billion years, the Moon would have been tens of thousands of kilometers closer to Earth. As a result, the planet rotated faster, and a year contained about 460 to 480 days instead of 365 days as it does today. That closer distance also made the Moon appear slightly larger and brighter in the sky. More importantly, its stronger gravitational pull created tides far more powerful than those of the present day. Each rise and fall of the tides did more than move seawater. It also stirred oxygen, nutrients, and minerals between layers of water, helping maintain the essential chemical cycles needed for early life. The sky of 1 billion years ago, therefore, was not merely an alien backdrop. It was an essential part of the system that prepared the first conditions for complex life. But if the sky still offered light and hope, beneath the ocean surface lay another paradox. The oceans were filled with water, minerals, and energy, yet for hundreds of millions of years, they remained almost a world without animals. Why did life have all the necessary conditions, yet still fail to explode? The answer lies within the tiny organisms quietly changing the entire planet. If you could dive into Earth's ocean about 1 billion years ago, the thing that would surprise you most would not be strange creatures, but the almost absolute silence. There were no schools of fish moving in layers, no jellyfish drifting with the currents, and no coral reefs or complex food chains. This may sound hard to believe, because water, sunlight, and the essential elements for life had all existed for a very long time. So what prevented animals from appearing? Unlike today's oceans, which are rich in dissolved oxygen, much of the ocean during the Mesoproterozoic existed in a ferruginous state, poor in oxygen but rich in dissolved iron. Not only was oxygen scarce, but many deep-sea regions were also euthynic, meaning they had no oxygen and contained large amounts of hydrogen sulfide, a gas that smells like rotten eggs and is extremely toxic to most modern animals. Today, similar conditions still exist in the deep waters of the Black Sea, where below roughly 150 to 200 meters, oxygen nearly disappears, and hydrogen sulfide accumulates at very high concentrations. Isotopic analyses of iron, sulfur, molybdenum, and uranium in ancient rocks show that many areas of the ocean 1 billion years ago once had similar characteristics, even on a much larger scale. An environment like that could hardly support the development of animal ecosystems. However, What is important to note is that the ocean at that time did not lack elements such as carbon, nitrogen, or sulfur. What was missing was an efficient source of energy. Every animal body requires a great deal of energy to maintain the activity of its cells and organs. Microorganisms could still survive, but building large and complex bodies was almost impossible. That difficulty was further sustained by a special geochemical loop. In iron-rich oceans, phosphorus, the essential element needed to create DNA, RNA, and ATP, was often trapped in seafloor sediments when it combined with iron-bearing minerals. This phenomenon, known as phosphorus trapping, reduced the amount of phosphorus returning to surface waters. Photosynthetic microorganisms therefore grew more slowly, and the amount of oxygen they produced was also lower. Low oxygen then allowed iron to continue existing in dissolved form and continue locking away phosphorus. A feedback loop lasting hundreds of millions of years was formed, making it difficult for the ocean to escape its oxygen-poor state. Seen from space, Earth at that time was still a blue planet, with oceans stretching all the way to the horizon. But beneath the water's surface was a world where chemistry determined every limit of life. What it lacked was an environment rich enough in oxygen to create the energy needed for the first complex bodies. Yet the history of life is always full of surprises. While the ocean seemed trapped in a deadlock for hundreds of millions of years, a quiet revolution was still taking place on a much smaller scale. Not in the oceans, not on the continents, but inside each living cell. It was this almost invisible innovation that would open the path toward multicellular organisms and eventually change the history of Earth completely. For hundreds of millions of years, they quietly transformed the oceans, the atmosphere, and eventually the history of life. The most important among them were cyanobacteria. They were one of the first groups of organisms to perform oxygen-producing photosynthesis, using sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide to create organic matter. By about 1 billion years ago, early eukaryotic algae had also begun contributing more and more to this process. Even so, cyanobacteria remained the foundation of marine ecosystems. Today, their descendants still live throughout the oceans, and, together with marine algae, produce about half of the oxygen generated by the biosphere each year. Yet that oxygen did not immediately accumulate in the atmosphere. Each newly created oxygen molecule almost instantly reacted with iron to form iron oxides, which then settled onto the seafloor. Microorganisms did more than change the composition of the atmosphere. They also left direct marks on the planet's surface, in shallow seas. They trapped grains of sand and minerals, forming layered structures known as stromatolites. At first glance, they may look like simple rocks, but each layer is actually the result of activity by countless generations of microorganisms. Today, living stromatolites in Shark Bay, Western Australia, continue to grow through almost the same mechanism that has existed for more than 3 billion years, making them one of the most valuable living fossils scientists can observe. Alongside this, most microorganisms did not live alone. They joined together into biofilms, biological mats, made of billions of cells bound together by substances they secreted themselves. If you have ever touched the slime on rocks in a stream or the plaque on your teeth, you have already encountered a modern biofilm. These communities can exchange chemical signals, share nutrients, and coordinate their activity far more effectively than isolated cells. While photosynthetic organisms produced oxygen and organic matter, many other groups of bacteria and archaea took on the role of recycling material. They participated in the carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and methane cycles, returning essential elements back into the environment. It was thanks to these tiny microorganisms that Earth's biogeochemical cycles were maintained continuously for billions of years. At first glance, it is hard to believe that single-celled organisms could change an entire planet. They did not merely adapt to Earth. Step by step, they transformed their own environment, preparing the stage for more complex forms of life. Yet, that revolution was still taking place only outside the cell. The decisive turning point in evolutionary history would come from an even smaller change, a reorganization within the structure of the cell itself. That almost invisible event would open the path toward plants, animals, and eventually human beings. After hundreds of millions of years quietly changing the atmosphere and the oceans, microorganisms had prepared almost every condition for a new world. But the greatest turning point in the history of life did not take place on the supercontinent Rodinia or in the middle of the Moravia Ocean. It happened inside a single cell. Many evolutionary biologists believe that if they had to choose the most important event in more than 4.5 billion years of Earth's history, they would not choose the appearance of dinosaurs or humans, but the birth of the eukaryotic cell, the common ancestor of all animals, plants, fungi, and ourselves. What makes this revolution extraordinary is that it did not begin with competition, but with cooperation. An ancient cell, belonging to the archaea group, engulfed a bacterium capable of breathing oxygen. Instead of being digested, that bacterium continued living inside the host cell. Over millions of years, the two organisms gradually became dependent on each other and merged into a new entity. This is the foundation of the endosymbiotic theory, proposed by Lynn Margulis in the late 1960s, and now supported by extensive genetic and molecular biological evidence. The significance of this event was not simply the appearance of another organelle, but the arrival of a new source of energy. Biologist Nick Lane has called this the energy revolution of life, because energy, not just DNA, was the force that broke through the evolutionary limits of the cell. From that point on, eukaryotic cells began to differ clearly from bacteria. DNA was protected inside the nucleus. Mitochondria specialized in energy production, while the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, and the cytoskeleton took on separate functions. In another evolutionary branch, some eukaryotic cells continued to absorb cyanobacteria. This time, the new guest evolved into the chloroplast, the photosynthetic organelle of algae and plants today. Like mitochondria, chloroplasts also retain their own DNA, further confirming that cooperation among single-celled organisms created some of the most important innovations in evolutionary history. The fossil of the red alga Bangiomorpha pubescens, dated to about 1.05 billion years ago, is considered the oldest evidence of a multicellular eukaryotic organism capable of sexual reproduction. Instead of merely copying themselves, individuals began combining genetic material to create new generations. It was this mechanism that accelerated the pace of evolution over the next hundreds of millions of years. What is remarkable is that this entire revolution happened in absolute silence. These cells, measuring just a few tens of micrometers, are silently changing the way life functions. For the next hundreds of millions of years, Earth still passed through an unusually slow stage of evolution that geologists call the boring billion. On the surface, the planet seemed calm. But beneath that stillness, plate tectonics, climate, and the carbon cycle were quietly preparing for the event that would change Earth's entire history. The breakup of Rodinia, and the greatest climate crisis ever known. From about 1.8 billion to 800 million years ago, the fossil record shows almost no clear leaps forward. There were no forests, no large animals, and no mass extinctions on a global scale. That is why geologists call this period the boring billion. But today, many scientists believe this was not 1 billion years of stagnation, but 1 billion years of preparation. If we fast-forwarded through hundreds of millions of years, Earth's surface would seem to change very little. Rodinia still existed for a long time. The climate remained relatively stable, and the oceans continued to cover most of the planet. Analyses of molybdenum, uranium, and chromium isotopes in ancient rocks show that most of the deep ocean remained oxygen-poor, while oxygen-rich water appeared only near the surface or along coastal regions. Oxygen was not the only limitation. Nutrients were also a major bottleneck. Phosphorus, the essential element needed to form DNA, RNA, and ATP, was delivered to the sea mainly through the weathering of rocks on the continents. But when supercontinents were relatively stable, tectonic activity and mountain building weakened, so the amount of minerals carried by rivers into the ocean also declined. In addition, large amounts of dissolved iron in the ocean trapped phosphate in sediments, making it difficult for photosynthetic microorganisms to flourish. But beneath the surface, life was still quietly changing. The genomes of eukaryotic organisms grew larger and became more finely regulated. Cells coordinated more effectively. Many diverse groups of algae appeared, and early forms of multicellularity began to be tested. Many researchers today see the Boring Billion as one of the most important stages in Earth's history. Each individual change was very small, but accumulated over hundreds of millions of years. They stored enough energy for an unprecedented turning point. Then, around 800 million years ago, that long-lasting balance began to break apart. A planet that had been prepared for nearly 1 billion years was now about to enter the greatest survival test life had ever faced. Snowball Earth. At first, there were only small cracks. Over time, they stretched for hundreds and then thousands of kilometers, forming continental rift zones. Magma rose from deep within Earth, thinning the crust, triggering volcanoes, and gradually splitting the supercontinent into several pieces. Within a human lifetime, that change is almost impossible to notice. But stretched across tens of millions of years, a new ocean will form. At first glance, this may seem like nothing more than a geological disturbance. But the breakup of Rodinia accidentally activated one of Earth's most powerful thermostats. As new mountain ranges rose and basaltic lava flows cooled, especially in warm, humid tropical regions, a huge amount of fresh rock was exposed to rain and air for the first time. Rainwater dissolved carbon dioxide, forming weak carbonic acid, then reacted with silicate minerals in the rock. The products of this process were carried by rivers into the sea, where carbon became locked away in carbonate rocks for millions of years. In other words, Earth was slowly pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and storing it in stone. This created an interesting paradox. Volcanoes normally release carbon dioxide and tend to warm the planet. But near the end of the Proterozoic eon, newly formed basaltic rocks in the tropics weathered so quickly that the rate of carbon dioxide absorption exceeded even the amount of carbon dioxide added by volcanoes. Strontium and carbon isotope studies, along with many modern geochemical models, all show that silicate weathering increased sharply during this period, gradually weakening the greenhouse effect. As the continents split into smaller pieces, the total length of coastlines increased significantly. New river systems formed, carrying large amounts of phosphorus and many trace elements from the continents into the sea. For cyanobacteria and eukaryotic algae, this was a massive supply of nutrients after hundreds of millions of years of scarcity. But when these completely independent processes interacted with one another over tens of millions of years, they unintentionally changed the entire climate system of the planet. The breakup of Rodinia did not merely change the map of the world. It also transformed the carbon cycle, the composition of the atmosphere, and the living conditions on Earth. But every major change comes with a price. Ice reflects up to 80 to 90% of sunlight, while the ocean reflects only about 6 to 10%. The more ice there was, the less heat Earth absorbed. The colder it became, the farther the ice spread. A dangerous positive feedback loop had been triggered. Ahead was no longer a stable planet, but the longest winter in geological history. A time when almost the entire Earth would be covered in ice. The story of Snowball Earth officially began. The breakup of Rodinia did more than split the continents apart. It also quietly altered Earth's entire climate regulation system. For tens of millions of years, silicate weathering continuously pulled carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, gradually weakening the greenhouse effect. By about 717 million years ago, the climate system crossed a critical threshold, opening the coldest period in the planet's history. Snowball Earth. If you looked at Earth from space at that time, you would find it hard to believe this had once been a blue planet. Ice no longer covered only the poles, but gradually spread toward the tropics. As the area of ice expanded, the ice albedo feedback began to dominate the climate. Snow and ice reflect up to 80 to 90% of sunlight, while the ocean reflects only about 6 to 10%. The more ice there was, the less heat the planet absorbed. The lower the temperature fell, the farther the ice expanded. A positive feedback loop was triggered, pushing Earth into a frozen state that could almost no longer stop itself. Geological evidence shows that Earth experienced at least 2 global ice ages during the Cryogenian period. The Sturtian, which began around 717 million years ago and lasted nearly 56 million years, and the Marinoan, which ended around 635 million years ago. From space, Earth had almost become a giant white sphere. At first, this hypothesis was considered too extreme. However, more and more evidence has strengthened it. If the ocean was covered by ice for tens of millions of years, why did the biosphere not disappear? Some equatorial regions may have had strips of open water or thin ice under the slush ball Earth model, allowing enough light to pass through and sustain photosynthesis. In addition, hydrothermal vents on the seafloor continued to provide chemical energy, supporting ecosystems that did not depend on sunlight at all. These refuges helped life survive a crisis that lasted tens of millions of years. When the ice melted, weathering across the continents intensified, carrying large amounts of phosphorus and nutrients into the ocean. Many scientists believe this chain of events opened the way for the organisms of the Ediacaran period, before life exploded in the Cambrian period around 541 million years ago. But one final question remains. If the entire planet was locked in ice for tens of millions of years, what force was powerful enough to melt that ice? One billion years ago, Earth was an alien world, almost impossible to recognize. Across the vast Merovia Ocean, the barren supercontinent Rodinia was shaped by powerful tectonic forces. Although the atmosphere was poor in oxygen and the land was empty, this planet was never a dead world. That seemingly silent era was proof of an Earth that never stopped changing, where primitive seeds of life and distant geological movements laid the great foundation for the modern world we know today. This was Earth 500 million years ago. A vast, deep, and almost motionless ocean covering nearly the entire planet. Yet beneath those silent waters, life was beginning to emerge through tiny, strange organisms unlike anything the world had seen before. For the first time in the history of life, these creatures evolved eyes to sense and interpret the world around them. Then suddenly, everything changed. But what triggered this strange and extraordinary explosion of life? While the ocean below was exploding with life, from outer space, Earth appeared strangely silent. The planet was dominated by water. Scientists estimate that nearly 80% of Earth's surface was covered by shallow oceans, spread across the globe like gigantic mirrors reflecting sunlight back into space. The continents had not yet merged into large landmasses as they are today. Instead, they existed as scattered fragments concentrated mostly in the southern regions of the ancient planet. There were no forests, no green plains, and no terrestrial ecosystems recognizable to modern life. The atmosphere during this time was also completely different. Carbon dioxide levels were many times higher than they are today, creating an intense greenhouse effect that wrapped around the planet. Volcanoes erupted continuously, releasing gas and ash into the atmosphere and leaving the skies frequently hazy. Sunlight reaching the ocean surface often appeared pale, yellow, and unstable through the thick atmospheric veil. There was no climatic balance like the one Earth experiences today. The planet resembled an overheating thermal engine, constantly fluctuating between hot and extremely hot conditions, never achieving long-term stability. Even the cycle of day and night was different. Earth rotated faster than it does now, causing a single day to last only around 21 to 22 hours. Time itself moved more quickly, forcing life to constantly adapt its existence within an environment that never truly stood still. Amid that chaos, the oceans became the primary stage for life. There was no land for organisms to dominate, no vegetation covering the surface. Everything unfolded beneath the water. Hard-shelled organisms began to appear as a biological response to an increasingly competitive environment. Primitive animals, such as sponges, early corals, and ancient arthropod-like creatures, slowly began shaping the first ecological networks on the planet. In that world, light, pressure, and ocean chemistry became the defining forces of survival. No permanent rules had yet been written, and from that incompleteness, Earth began entering a new chapter, a chapter defined not by stability, but by transformation. A planet where nearly 70 to 80% of the surface was covered by water, but not the deep, stable oceans we know today. These were vast, shallow seas stretching across thousands of kilometers, where sunlight penetrated only a few dozen to at most a few hundred meters below the surface. Beyond depths of roughly 200 meters, darkness almost completely took over, and within that thin upper layer of illuminated water, Earth's entire primitive ecosystem was operating. The continental surface at that time was little more than barren rock, constantly eroded by wind and salt water. Surface temperatures fluctuated violently, while atmospheric CO2 levels were many times higher than today, creating an intense greenhouse effect that made land nearly uninhabitable. And yet, among the smallest organisms on Earth were the ones exerting the greatest influence. cyanobacteria. These microscopic life forms, first appearing more than 2.5 billion years ago, continued playing a critical role throughout the Cambrian period. Through photosynthesis, they converted carbon dioxide and sunlight into oxygen. Scientists estimate that during this ancient era, microbial systems may have contributed more than 20 to 30% of global oxygen production through marine photosynthetic activity, helping stabilize an atmosphere still struggling to reach equilibrium. Across the seafloor, dense microbial mats spread like living carpets. They did not merely exist. They engineered environments. Layer after layer of microorganisms accumulated, decomposed, and regenerated, creating the first fundamental energy cycles of the planet. But the oceans were no longer inhabited by microbes alone. This was also the era when multicellular life began to explode in complexity. One of the most iconic examples was the trilobite, an ancient arthropod group that first appeared around 521 million years ago and rapidly became one of the most widespread life forms on Earth. Fossil evidence suggests that more than 20,000 trilobite species once existed, ranging in size from only a few millimeters to over 70 centimeters long. They crawled across the seafloor, hunted prey, consumed organic remains, and at times became prey themselves for larger predators. Alongside them existed ancient sponges, primitive corals, and early mollusk-like organisms. Some species even developed symmetrical body structures, a major evolutionary advancement that allowed them to move with direction and coordination through the water. For the first time in Earth's history, life was no longer simply existing. It was beginning to organize itself into ecosystems. Most importantly, and perhaps most revolutionary of all, was energy itself. In the Cambrian oceans, energy no longer came solely from simple chemistry or sunlight alone. True food chains were beginning to emerge. For the first time, life became a network of continuous competition. As oxygen levels increased in both the atmosphere and seawater, entirely new metabolic possibilities opened. Organisms could generate energy more efficiently, develop larger bodies, and most importantly, evolve primitive nervous systems. This was the moment when eyes first appeared and rapidly evolved. At first, simple light-sensitive structures could only distinguish brightness from darkness. But once living creatures began seeing one another, a true evolutionary revolution had begun. Earth was entering a phase that science now calls the Cambrian explosion, one of the most dramatic evolutionary leaps in the history of life. Within just 20 to 25 million years, nearly all major animal groups suddenly appeared. Organisms began developing more complex multicellular bodies, complete with tissues, organs, and, most importantly, the ability to move with intention. This marked the transition from passive existence to active interaction with the environment. The dominant life forms emerging during this era belonged to three major branches: arthropods, mollusks, and the earliest primitive chordates. One of the most important reasons this explosion of diversity happened so rapidly was the increase of oxygen within the oceans. As oxygen levels rose, metabolic rates increased as well, allowing more complex organisms to exist without being trapped by severe energy limitations. Over the course of only a few tens of millions of years, Earth witnessed the nearly simultaneous appearance of entirely new biological structures. Hard shells for defense, limbs for movement, tentacles for sensing the environment, and, most importantly, primitive nervous systems. For the first time in planetary history, life gained the ability to process information from its surroundings, instead of relying solely on simple chemical reactions. That transformation led to one of the most important turning points of all: the emergence of eyes. At first, eyes were little more than primitive light-sensitive spots capable of distinguishing brightness from darkness. But within only 5 to 10 million years, an extremely short period by geological standards, eyes evolved into far more complex structures capable of recognizing shapes and motion. It was a revolutionary evolutionary leap, because for the first time, predators and prey could truly see one another. And once you can see the creature hunting you, or the prey you are chasing, the entire game of survival changes completely. Life entered a biological arms race. Organisms evolved harder shells, sharper spikes, and faster movement. Meanwhile, predators developed sharper senses and more precise hunting abilities. This was the first time in Earth's history that something resembling what we now call accelerated selective pressure emerged. In less than 25 million years, Earth transformed from a world dominated by simple microbial life into a planet filled with complex animal ecosystems. And from that point forward, one of the fundamental laws of life became permanently written into Earth's history. It is not the strongest species that survives, but the one capable of adapting fastest to change. This was no longer a peaceful ocean filled with passive drifting organisms. It had become the first battlefield of evolution. What happens when a living creature gains the ability to actively hunt for the very first time? More than 520 million years ago, the Cambrian oceans began giving rise to the first true predators. And among the most remarkable of them was Anomalocaris, a creature that looked as though it had emerged from an alien world. Nearly 1 meter long, enormous compared to most organisms of its time that measured only a few centimeters, Anomalocaris possessed 2 flexible frontal appendages for grabbing prey, a circular mouth lined with razor-like tooth plates, and highly advanced compound eyes. Fossil evidence suggests that the eyes of Anomalocaris may have contained more than 16,000 individual lenses. For comparison, modern dragonflies, among the most visually advanced insects alive today, possess roughly 30,000 lenses. That means more than 500 million years ago, nature had already created a visual system powerful enough to detect movement within the dim waters of the ancient oceans. And from the moment predators like these appeared, life could no longer remain still. This created an evolutionary pressure, unlike anything that had existed before. Prey species began developing hard shells made of calcium carbonate, an extraordinarily important biological turning point. Cambrian fossils reveal that the thickness and complexity of biological armor increased rapidly during this period. It was a direct response to predation. Once life became hunted, it began learning how to defend itself. The Cambrian oceans were no longer silent environments. They became worlds filled with invisible tension. Trilobites began burrowing into mud to hide. Some species evolved sharp spines along their bodies. Fragile, soft-bodied organisms gradually disappeared or were pushed into less dangerous environments. Food chains became increasingly complex, and for the first time, Earth's ecosystems developed something we could describe as dominant predators. Life on Earth was no longer evolving in peace. Every evolutionary step created competition. Every biological innovation generated new pressure across the ecosystem. And yet it was precisely that brutality that accelerated the diversity of life itself. Without predation, life may have remained nothing more than simple drifting organisms floating through the oceans forever. It was the fear of being eaten that forced life to invent biological armor, nervous systems, reflexes, speed, sensory awareness, and eventually primitive intelligence. In other words, part of the modern life that exists today was born from fear at the bottom of the ocean more than 500 million years ago. Toward the end of the Cambrian period and the eras that followed, Earth began entering one of the most important geological cycles in its history, the formation of Gondwana. This was a massive supercontinent composed of regions that today we recognize as South America, Africa, India, Australia, and Antarctica. What is astonishing is this: lands now separated by thousands of kilometers were once connected as a single unified mass. If you could stand on Gondwana around 500 million years ago, you would see no borders between the modern continents. There was no Atlantic Ocean, no Indian Ocean as we know it today. There was only an enormous landmass located primarily in the southern hemisphere, surrounded by endless ancient oceans. But why did that matter to life? Because when continents move, habitats change with them. And when environments change, evolution is forced to adapt. This was the point where geology and biology became deeply intertwined. Life does not evolve in isolation. It is shaped by the movement of the planet itself. When tectonic plates collide, mountains rise. When they separate, oceans expand. Volcanic eruptions release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, altering global temperatures. Ocean currents shift direction. Climate patterns fluctuate. A shallow sea can become a barren desert after only a few million years. A region once rich in oxygen can transform into a dead zone. And every organism living within those environments is forced to adapt or disappear. Scientists refer to the cycle of supercontinent formation and breakup as the Wilson cycle. A supercontinent forms, survives for hundreds of millions of years, and then gradually fractures apart due to thermal pressure rising from beneath the mantle. Afterward, the continental fragments drift, collide, and eventually merge again into a new supercontinent. It is a cycle that has repeated throughout nearly the entire history of Earth. In other words, the world map has never been fixed. It is a film moving in extreme slow motion, and yet that movement creates an enormous biological effect: evolutionary isolation. As continents drift farther apart, populations of organisms become separated. Species that once lived together are divided by oceans thousands of kilometers wide. And over time, they begin evolving in completely different directions. This is one of the reasons biodiversity on Earth expanded more dramatically over time. Not because the planet became more stable, but because it increasingly divided life into separate evolutionary laboratories. Australia became one of the clearest examples during later eras. After separating from Gondwana more than 100 million years ago, the continent became almost completely isolated. As a result, marsupials evolved along their own unique path, producing strange creatures found nowhere else on Earth. But the principle itself had begun far earlier, during the first great movements of the ancient continents. And across the hundreds of millions of years that followed, the slow drift of continents would continue reshaping the planet on an enormous scale, opening the path for the first forests, transforming the global climate, and ultimately guiding life onto land itself. More than 470 million years ago, Earth's land surface was almost a dead world. The continents were nothing more than barren rock, broken apart by wind, rain, and constant geological activity. Sunlight struck the surface directly, without a thick ozone layer like today, to fully shield the planet from ultraviolet radiation. Temperatures fluctuated violently between day and night. During the day, rocks could become scorching under the intense greenhouse conditions. At night, temperatures dropped rapidly because there were no forests, no vegetation, and no stable atmospheric moisture to retain heat. The first pioneers were not animals, but layers of cyanobacteria and microbial mats. These organisms began attaching themselves to damp rock surfaces near coastlines and river mouths. The microbial communities secreted biological slime that trapped mineral dust and water, slowly forming the first layers of organic material. Millions of years passed simply to create a few centimeters of primitive biological ground. Yet it was that fragile foundation that changed the entire future of the planet. For the first time, land began gaining the ability to retain water and nutrients. After the microbial communities came the first primitive forms of terrestrial plants. They were not trees like those we know today, but more similar to tiny modern mosses, liverworts, and hornworts, low to the ground and heavily dependent on moist environments. They possessed no true roots and lacked advanced vascular systems for transporting water, which meant they could survive only near reliable water sources. But their appearance was revolutionary. Ancient fossils suggest that primitive land plants began spreading across Earth roughly 470 to 450 million years ago. As photosynthesis on land increased, atmospheric carbon dioxide slowly began to decline. And then a chain reaction began. Plant roots, still extremely primitive, started breaking apart rock. Weathering accelerated, releasing minerals into the environment. Dead organic material accumulated and gradually formed true soil. Soil retained water more efficiently, allowing even more plants to grow. More plants then produced more oxygen and more soil. A self-accelerating biological feedback loop had begun. What is truly astonishing is that life was no longer simply adapting to the planet. It had begun redesigning the planet itself. Before this era, Earth completely controlled the living conditions of organisms. But now, the first life forms on land were actively transforming the atmosphere, geology, and global chemical cycles in ways never seen before. Those tiny layers of primitive vegetation were silently preparing the stage for every terrestrial ecosystem that would come later. In the oceans, water supported the body. On land, organisms had to support their own weight. In water, cells remained constantly surrounded by moisture. On land, drying out even briefly could mean death. And so, life was forced to invent entirely new biological technologies, protective coatings against water loss, structures capable of supporting body weight, and internal systems for transporting water through living tissue. These were the evolutionary breakthroughs that would eventually open the path for giant trees, ancient forests, and ultimately the rise of animals on land. The appearance of vascular plants marked one of the greatest turning points in Earth's history. The first organisms to develop internal systems capable of transporting water and minerals throughout their bodies. These were the distant ancestors of every forest that exists on Earth today. Plant groups such as ancient ferns, lycophytes, and horsetails began spreading across vast humid swamps. At first, they stood only a few dozen centimeters tall. But evolution did not stop there. Over time, some species developed primitive woody trunks and eventually reached heights greater than 10 meters. By around 385 million years ago, the first true forests had emerged. If you could walk into an ancient Devonian forest, it would feel unlike any modern forest on Earth. The ground was covered in dense layers of black mud filled with slowly decomposing plant matter. Primitive tree-like organisms rose everywhere like gigantic pillars from an alien world. But the most astonishing aspect was not how these forests looked. It was the fact that they began transforming the global climate itself. Before the rise of widespread plant life, Earth's atmosphere contained extremely high levels of carbon dioxide. During many ancient periods, atmospheric CO2 concentrations may have been 10 to 15 times higher than modern levels. That intensified the greenhouse effect, drove global temperatures higher, and made the climate profoundly unstable. But plants accomplished something no previous life form had ever achieved on such a massive scale. They removed carbon directly from the atmosphere and locked it inside their own bodies. Through photosynthesis, the ancient forests absorbed carbon dioxide and used carbon to build trunks, roots, and woody tissue. When those plants died, much of that carbon became buried beneath layers of sediment instead of immediately returning to the atmosphere. Over millions of years, this process slowly pulled enormous amounts of carbon dioxide out of Earth's atmosphere. This was no longer simply biological evolution. Life itself was beginning to regulate the climate system of an entire planet. Geological evidence suggests that during the Devonian and later Carboniferous periods, atmospheric oxygen levels rose dramatically, at times reaching roughly 30 to 35%, far higher than today's 21%. This produced enormous biological effects. Insects evolved gigantic sizes because respiratory systems functioned more efficiently in oxygen-rich environments. Some ancient dragonfly-like species, such as Meganeura, developed wingspans exceeding 70 centimeters. But rising oxygen levels also meant wildfires became far more common. A single lightning strike could burn hundreds of kilometers of primitive forest. And from the ashes, plant life would rise again even stronger. Earth had entered an entirely new biological cycle. One in which life was no longer merely adapting to the environment, but actively creating the environment for itself. Viewed from space, Earth was slowly transforming from a barren, rocky planet into a truly living world. But once life gains the power to alter a planet's global climate, it also gains the power to unintentionally push itself toward entirely new crises. There were periods in Earth's history when the planet became so hot that ice nearly vanished from every polar region. Scientists refer to this state as greenhouse Earth. During eras such as the late Devonian and many intervals throughout the Paleozoic, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels were many times higher than they are today. That created an enormous greenhouse effect. Heat became trapped within the atmosphere, driving global temperatures dramatically higher. The polar regions no longer remained permanently frozen as they are now. Sea levels rose, flooding vast, low-lying continental regions beneath warm, shallow seas. But the problem was never only temperature. A hotter planet also meant more extreme weather. Water evaporated more intensely from the oceans, generating storms on scales far beyond most modern phenomena. Imagine superstorms lasting for weeks across endless ancient oceans, where no stable ecosystems yet existed to weaken the atmosphere's raw power. And then there were the volcanoes. During Earth's ancient history, tectonic activity was far more intense than it is today. The mantle beneath the crust remained hotter, allowing magma to rise toward the surface far more easily. These eruptions were not merely isolated volcanoes like the ones we know now. At times, enormous magma provinces erupted continuously for hundreds of thousands of years, releasing enough carbon dioxide and sulfur into the atmosphere to alter the global climate itself. Some ancient eruptions may have produced millions of cubic kilometers of lava. And yet the paradox is this: those catastrophes were also driving evolution forward. Every time the climate shifted violently, ecosystems collapsed and reorganized. Some species vanished, others adapted. Entirely new environments emerged, creating opportunities for new evolutionary branches to explode into existence. Throughout Earth's history, long-term stability has been almost non-existent. This planet evolves through crisis. Today, the Sahara Desert already feels unforgiving, but the ancient supercontinents may have produced interior regions far more extreme during the day temperatures could rise to brutal levels beneath intense greenhouse conditions. At night, temperatures dropped rapidly because of the lack of atmospheric moisture capable of retaining heat. The contrast between day and night generated violent weather systems unlike almost anything experienced on modern Earth. If we descend into Earth's oceans today, the deeper we go, the more sunlight disappears, temperatures fall, pressure rises, and life becomes increasingly sparse. But more than 450 million years ago, the oceans were not merely a place that contained life. They were the entire center of life itself. This was the transitional era between the Cambrian and the Ordovician periods, one of the most important chapters in the evolutionary history of the oceans. Ecosystems were no longer as simple as they had once been. They were becoming layered, complex, and increasingly competitive. If you could look down into the deep seafloor of that ancient world, you would not see an empty darkness. One of the most important foundations of these ecosystems was the hydrothermal vent systems scattered across the ocean floor. In these regions, seawater seeped down through Earth's crust, became superheated by magma, and then erupted back upward through cracks in the seafloor at temperatures that could exceed 300 to 400 degrees Celsius. Yet, because of the immense pressure in the deep ocean, sometimes more than 250 times atmospheric pressure, the water did not boil in the normal way. Within that extreme environment, life did not depend on sunlight. It depended on chemosynthesis, the process of using chemical energy from reactions involving hydrogen sulfide, methane, and minerals to generate biological energy. This marked an extraordinarily important moment in Earth's history. Life demonstrated that sunlight was not a mandatory requirement for existence. Around these vents, bacteria and microbial organisms formed dense biological communities. They resembled chemical oases, surrounded by the black emptiness of the deep ocean. From there, energy began flowing upward through higher biological levels, forming food chains entirely independent from the planet's surface. If the shallow seas were where life exploded in physical diversity, then the deep oceans were where life learned how to survive under the most extreme conditions imaginable. In the upper ocean layers, Cambrian and Ordovician ecosystems continued expanding rapidly. Creatures, such as trilobites, remained incredibly widespread, with more than 20,000 species having existed throughout Earth's history. They moved across the seafloor, burrowed through mud searching for food, and evolved into many different body forms depending on their environments. Alongside them, mollusks and brachiopods began dominating large portions of the ocean floor. Some species evolved hardened shells to survive the growing pressure of predation. Food chains became increasingly complex, no longer consisting of simple relationships between predator and prey, but transforming into layered biological networks where energy moved through multiple ecological levels. What is remarkable is this: the deeper you descend, the slower life becomes, but it never disappears. At depths of 1,000 meters, pressure can reach nearly 100 atmospheres, enough to crush structures incapable of adapting. temperatures often fall to only 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. Sunlight disappears completely after roughly the first 200 meters. A region scientists now call the permanent dark zone. The ancient oceans were not merely places where life exploded in abundance. They were also where life learned how to exist without light. Some scientific models suggest that hydrothermal vents may have provided the ideal conditions for the very first chemical reactions that eventually produced life itself, thanks to their stable and continuous energy sources. The oceans, therefore, were never a uniform mass of water. They were a living three-dimensional structure where life distributed itself according to light, pressure, and chemistry. And within that entire system, one truth becomes clear. The oceans did not merely nurture life in the distant past. They were the first laboratory where life learned how to become complex. When we think of mass extinctions, we usually think of failure. We imagine worlds destroyed, creatures gone forever, and entire chapters of history erased from the planet. But when scientists look deeper into the fossil record spanning more than 540 million years, they uncover a remarkable paradox. Every time life seemed on the verge of losing, it found a way to begin a new chapter. The history of life is the story of those that changed when the world changed. We often assume that the dominant species will be the ones that survive the longest. The giant coral reefs that once dominated ancient oceans disappeared. The powerful armored animals that once ruled the seas became extinct. Non-avian dinosaurs governed the planet for more than 160 million years, far longer than the entire existence of humanity many times over, yet in the end, they could not survive a fateful day 66 million years ago. Animals capable of feeding on many different kinds of food, organisms able to endure low oxygen environments, food shortages, or extreme temperatures. But when disaster arrived, those very ordinary traits became advantages for survival. When environments remain stable, evolution often produces increasingly specialized organisms. Imagine a species that can live only within tropical coral reefs. If ocean temperatures change or the reefs disappear, its entire survival strategy collapses. During the planet's darkest days, flexibility becomes more valuable than strength. What is astonishing is that after every wave of destruction, life does not simply recover. The former rulers disappear, and new opportunities emerge. Groups of organisms that once lived quietly in the shadows suddenly gain the chance to flourish and shape the next world. In other words, mass extinction is both an ending and a beginning. And that is the first lesson of this journey. Life prevails because it always leaves survivors behind. No matter how great the catastrophe, There are always organisms flexible enough to endure. But this paradox has only just begun to reveal itself. Around 444 million years ago, life faced its first crisis large enough to push the entire planet to the brink of collapse. At that time, nearly all complex life existed in the oceans. The land remained barren, with no forests, no large animals, and no ecosystems capable of replacing the seas. And then, disaster arrived. As the supercontinent Gondwana gradually drifted toward the South Pole, enormous ice sheets began to form. Earth entered a severe ice age, and sea levels fell by tens of meters. That is exactly what happened to the shallow marine ecosystems of the Ordovician period. Those shallow seas were the center of life. Trilobite swarms wandered across the seafloor. Ancient bryozoan forests filtered food from the currents. Creatures resembling modern lamp shells, known as brachiopods, covered the ocean floor. Primitive cephalopods such as Orthoceras, with their long, straight shells that could reach several meters in length, were among the most formidable predators of their age. But then the seas retreated, and habitats that had remained stable for millions of years disappeared within a very short span of geological time. The result was that approximately 85% of marine species vanished. This was the first mass extinction in the history of complex life on Earth. Yet, something strange began to emerge when paleontologists studied the fossils that remained. Why did some species survive while others disappeared? If strength had been the deciding factor, large predators such as Orthoceras should have prevailed. Some deep-dwelling brachiopods survived. Certain small mollusks capable of adapting to a wide range of temperatures also made it through the crisis. Species perfectly adapted to their current environment are often more vulnerable when the world changes. In contrast, species capable of tolerating a wide variety of conditions tend to have a greater chance of survival. What would happen if just one of those essential factors disappeared? Its entire survival strategy would collapse. But a species capable of living in many different environments will always have alternatives. They were the architects of the new one. And this is also the first survival lesson Earth leaves behind after more than 500 million years of evolution. Flexibility is often more important than dominance. But if you think cold was the greatest threat life ever faced, history still holds an even more terrifying chapter ahead. Because in the next great test, the thing that disappeared was not a habitat. It was something that nearly every complex organism needs to survive: oxygen. Between approximately 372 and 359 million years ago, during the late Devonian period, Earth was still teeming with life. The oceans were home to some of the most complex ecosystems ever to exist. Ancient coral reefs stretched for thousands of kilometers. Armored fish, such as Dunkleosteus, one of the most fearsome predators of its age, dominated the seas with jaws capable of crushing prey with tremendous biting force. Schools of lobe-finned fish and lungfish were beginning to experiment with the first evolutionary steps toward life on land. This phenomenon is known as oceanic oxygen depletion, or anoxia. What caused this catastrophe? Scientists believe that as the first primitive forests expanded, they altered the planet's nutrient cycles. As a result, enormous regions of the oceans gradually became suffocating. What happens to an ocean when oxygen disappears? The largest organisms, those requiring the most oxygen, were among the first to suffer. Ancient coral reefs that had once been centers of biodiversity began to decline. Many groups of reef-building organisms vanished from the fossil record. Ecosystems that had endured for tens of millions of years collapsed. Giant armored fish such as Dunkleosteus, symbols of power in the Devonian oceans, also became extinct during this period. Another example can be found among the lobe-finned fishes of the Sarcopterygii group. They were not the rulers of the Devonian seas, yet some of their lineages survived the crisis. The winners of that age left no descendants for the future, while some of the less remarkable creatures became the ancestors of nearly every land-dwelling vertebrate alive today. A species does not need to be the strongest to survive. It only needs to endure longer than the apocalypse. That is the second survival lesson in the history of life. Ahead lies a catastrophe so immense that every previous extinction appears like a small crack on the surface of history. A day when life truly came close to complete defeat, the Great Dying. Up to this point in the story, life had survived two enormous catastrophes. One when the oceans shrank during an ice age, and another when the seas gradually lost their oxygen. But nothing could prepare the planet for what happened around 252 million years ago. Paleontologists call this event the Permian-Triassic mass extinction. But it is also known by another, far more terrifying name, the Great Dying. Imagine this. If 100 marine species existed before the catastrophe, only 4 to 10 remained after it was over. Approximately 90 to 96% of all marine species vanished. On land, around 70% of vertebrate species became extinct. What happened? In the region that is now Siberia, one of the largest volcanic eruptions in planetary history began. Not for a few days or a few years, but for hundreds of thousands of years. Lava covered more than 7 million square kilometers. Large areas of the oceans became dead zones. Worse still, geochemical studies suggest that in some places, anaerobic bacteria flourished and produced hydrogen sulfide, a toxic gas with the smell of rotten eggs. Seas that had once been filled with life became poisonous to the very organisms living within them. If animal groups that had succeeded for hundreds of millions of years all failed, then who survived? Part of the answer lies in a little-known creature called Lystrosaurus. It was not the most terrifying predator. It was simply a plant-eating animal roughly the size of a large pig. With a low-slung body, short legs, and a fairly ordinary appearance. Yet after the mass extinction, Lystrosaurus fossils appeared everywhere. In some regions, more than 90% of all vertebrate fossils discovered belong to this species. Why? Because Lystrosaurus possessed exactly the traits needed in a post-apocalyptic world. Its body was not excessively large, so it required less energy. Its diet was not highly specialized. Its ability to burrow helped it avoid the harsh climatic conditions at the surface. The most specialized organisms are often the first to disappear. The most adaptable organisms tend to have a greater chance of survival. Do you notice something? If this catastrophe had been only slightly more severe, many scientists believe that the remaining vertebrate lineages might have been completely wiped out. From the fragments that remained, a handful of small lineages began to recover. But in the new world forged from the ashes of the great dying, they were preparing to seize the greatest opportunity in the history of evolution. Were the survivors truly lucky? Or is there a pattern behind their success, one that life has repeated for hundreds of millions of years? Paleontologists have spent decades searching for the answer. They have compared thousands of fossils from different groups of organisms, from the Ordovician and Devonian extinctions to the Permian event. Earth's champions of survival are almost never the strongest creatures. They were not the largest predators like Dunkleosteus. They were not the organisms that dominated the oceans like trilobites. Nor were they the most successful specialized species of their time. Instead, most survivors shared a set of very ordinary traits. They were usually smaller. They could eat a wider variety of foods. They reproduced more quickly. They could live in a greater range of environments. And most importantly, they required less energy to survive. Why does that matter? When ecosystems are stable, larger species often have the advantage. They control food, resources, territories, and compete more effectively. But when catastrophe strikes, everything is reversed. Food sources disappear. Climates change. Species that depend on a single food source often face great danger when environments change. If that food source disappears, they are left with almost no alternatives. In contrast, omnivorous species have more opportunities to survive. Another trait that frequently appears among survivors is a broad geographic range. If a species exists in only one location, a local disaster can erase the entire species. But if it lives across multiple continents or a variety of environments, the chances that some populations will survive become much greater. And there is one more factor, perhaps the most important of all: adaptability. Do you notice what all the survivors we have discussed have in common? They all share one defining characteristic. They are not dependent on a single state of the world. And that may be the greatest secret the history of life has ever revealed. For more than 540 million years, Earth has rewarded those that adapt best. Strength may help a species dominate an era, but the ability to change is what allows a lineage to endure across many eras. That is why crocodiles still exist while many of their larger relatives disappeared. Horseshoe crabs have survived with little change for more than 400 million years. And the tiny ancestors of mammals quietly persisted alongside the giants that ruled the planet. Adaptation is more important than dominance. That is not merely a lesson of evolution. It is a principle tested through hundreds of millions of years of catastrophe. But what is fascinating is that this principle does not only help organisms survive. Sometimes it allows the underdogs to rise and dominate the entire world. And there is no clearer example than the group of animals quietly waiting for their opportunity after the Great Dying. If you traveled back in time to around 220 million years ago, you would not see dinosaurs ruling Earth. That may sound difficult to believe. When we think of the age of dinosaurs, we usually imagine giant creatures dominating the planet for more than 160 million years. But throughout much of the Triassic period, dinosaurs were only a relatively small group of animals, living alongside rivals that were far more formidable. At that time, the world belonged to other reptilian groups. There were giant predators, such as Prototaxites, reaching lengths of up to 5 meters and occupying the top of the food chain. There were armored herbivores such as Apatosaurus wandering across the arid plains. Numerous ancient archosaur groups occupied most of the major ecological niches on land. Meanwhile, some of the earliest dinosaurs, such as Coelophysis and Eoraptor, were relatively small. They did not dominate in numbers, yet the history of life has repeatedly shown that the future does not belong to those who are winning today. Around 201 million years ago, Earth entered another crisis. This was the Triassic-Jurassic extinction event, the catastrophe that marked the boundary between two major geological periods. Over a relatively short span of geological time, millions of cubic kilometers of lava erupted onto the surface. Vast quantities of carbon dioxide poured into the atmosphere, and global temperatures rose dramatically. The climate became unstable, and many ecosystems on land and in the oceans began to collapse. The reptilian groups that had dominated for tens of millions of years began to disappear. Many of the larger relatives of ancient crocodiles suffered severe declines or became completely extinct. Apex predators that had once seemed invincible no longer appeared in the fossil record after this event. But when the rulers disappear, what happens to the empty spaces they leave behind? That was the moment dinosaurs stepped onto the stage. What is fascinating is that dinosaurs did not appear after the catastrophe. They already existed. They were simply waiting for an opportunity. Scientists call this concept an ecological niche. When a species becomes extinct, its food sources, territory, and ecological role are left vacant. The organisms that survive gain the opportunity to expand and evolve into those empty spaces. New lineages emerged at an increasingly rapid pace. Within only a few tens of millions of years after the extinction, dinosaurs diversified into an extraordinary variety of forms. From a relatively small group of animals, they became the most successful land vertebrates in history. Their upright limbs, positioned directly beneath the body, allowed them to move more efficiently than many other ancient reptiles. A more advanced respiratory system may also have helped them adapt to changing environments. Most importantly, they were flexible enough to take advantage of the new world that emerged after catastrophe. Do you recognize the familiar pattern? In the Ordovician, organisms capable of enduring harsh environments survived. In the Devonian, species adapted to low oxygen conditions survived. In the Permian, organisms that required less energy survived. And now, after the Triassic extinction, a group of animals that was not yet the strongest, but flexible enough to seize an opportunity, became the winner. The third survival lesson of Earth begins to reveal itself. Catastrophe does not only destroy. Every mass extinction is like history pressing a reset button. The old rulers disappear, new rules emerge, and sometimes the creatures once living at the margins become the leading characters of the next age. But the story contains an even greater paradox. After more than 160 million years of ruling the planet, dinosaurs seem to be the perfect example of evolutionary success. No group of land animals had ever dominated for so long. Yet the very principle that raised them to the summit would also be the principle that brought them down. Because somewhere in the future, another catastrophe was approaching. And this time, not even the dinosaur empire would escape it. For more than 160 million years, dinosaurs ruled Earth. That span of time is so vast that it is difficult to comprehend. Tyrannosaurus rex lived closer to our own time than it did to the earliest dinosaurs that appeared after the Triassic extinction. Giants such as Argentinosaurus weighed tens of tons, while predators such as Tyrannosaurus stood at the top of the food chain. From the perspective of any creature living at the end of the Cretaceous period, the dinosaur empire must have seemed destined to last forever. But the history of life follows a relentless rule. No empire is eternal. Around 66 million years ago, an object approximately 10 to 12 kilometers in diameter hurtled toward Earth at a speed exceeding 70,000 kilometers per hour. It struck the shallow seas near what is now Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, creating the Chicxulub crater, roughly 180 kilometers wide. In the instant of impact, the energy released was equivalent to billions of atomic bombs. Global temperatures plunged. Photosynthesis nearly came to a halt. This is what makes the KPG extinction so extraordinary. The asteroid did not directly kill most of the organisms on the planet. It destroyed the life support system of the entire world. Once the foundation collapsed, even the strongest creatures could not survive. Fossil evidence shows that approximately 75% of all species on Earth disappeared. Every non-avian dinosaur became extinct. Giant marine reptiles such as Mosasaurus vanished. Enormous flying creatures such as Quetzalcoatlus were never seen again. So who survived? By conventional logic, we might assume that the largest, strongest, or most intelligent creatures would have been the most likely candidates. Yet the survivors were often so small that they were almost unnoticed. Consider the ancestors of mammals living at that time. Most were only about the size of modern mice or squirrels, and that turned out to be an advantage. Many species could burrow underground, where they were protected from extreme temperatures and the fires raging across the surface. They fed on insects, seeds, carrion, and almost anything else they could find. They did not require enormous food supplies to sustain their bodies. They could endure long periods without eating and survive in freshwater environments that were less severely affected. Many turtle species also survived the catastrophe thanks to their ability to withstand harsh conditions and their low metabolic demands. Even more astonishing is this. If the asteroid had not struck Earth on that day, dinosaurs might very well have continued to dominate the planet for tens of millions of years more. And if that had happened, would mammals ever have become the dominant group on Earth? Would primates have emerged? Would humans have existed at all? In a sense, our existence today began on the day an asteroid brought the dinosaur empire to an end. But that is only the beginning of the story, because the tiny creatures that survived the apocalypse were not merely going to endure, they were about to transform the history of Earth completely. Before the asteroid impact, mammals had already existed for a long time. Species such as Didelphodon and Eomea were only about the size of mice or small weasels. They hunted insects, fed on seeds, dug burrows, and were primarily active at night to avoid predatory dinosaurs. In a world dominated by giant animals, such as Tyrannosaurus rex, Triceratops, and Edmontosaurus, mammals seemed little more than insignificant supporting characters. Then the apocalypse arrived. Survival was only the first step. What happened afterward was truly remarkable. Within just about 10 million years after the extinction event, mammals diversified at an unprecedented rate. Some evolved into large herbivores, others became predators, some returned to aquatic environments and eventually gave rise to whales. Others learned to glide among the branches and became the ancestors of primates. This was one of the most spectacular evolutionary radiations ever recorded in the fossil record. Around 55 million years ago, the first primates appeared. They possessed forward-facing eyes that allowed them to judge distances more effectively while moving through trees. Tens of millions of years later, some primate groups evolved into apes. Then, from small populations in Africa, species belonging to the genus Homo emerged. Finally, around 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens entered history. When we look back across this entire journey, an astonishing truth begins to emerge. Humans are not only the product of evolution, we are also the product of catastrophes. If the Ordovician extinction had unfolded differently, many marine lineages might not have survived. If the Devonian extinction had completely wiped out the lobe-finned fishes, land vertebrates might never have appeared. If the Great Dying had been only slightly more severe, the distant ancestors of mammals might have vanished forever. And if the Chicxulub asteroid had missed Earth, there very likely would never have been humans. That is the greatest paradox of this story. We often view extinction as a period. But many times, it is also a comma marking the beginning of an entirely new chapter. From tiny mammals living beneath the feet of dinosaurs eventually emerged creatures capable of building cities, decoding DNA, and looking back into the distant past to understand their own origins. After journeying through the great mass extinctions, are these events merely random accidents of history? Or is there a deeper principle behind them, one that has quietly shaped all life on Earth? The fossil record has been answering that question for more than 500 million years. Strength is not the deciding factor. Size is not the deciding factor. We begin to realize that the 5 great mass extinctions are 5 chapters of the same underlying rule. The source of the next crisis may not come from an ice age, an asteroid, or a supervolcano. It may come from the very species that learned how to understand that entire rule. Thank you for staying with WUFO Space until the very end of this journey through the vast universe. If you found this video interesting and insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to WUFO Space so you won't miss our next cosmic adventures. Your support means the world to us and fuels our passion to keep exploring the wonders beyond.